Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I agonized with doing more counter programming given all the news, but I feel at some point I have to do a little due diligence and actually be on the news. And also because we have a long-standing relationship with our next guest, who is in the world of in the world in the waters that I swim. He is the most respected person I know who is skeptical of taking out the Iranian nuclear program, and he's also a dear friend of mine. And also, this is a very useful, very useful way for me to sidestep some criticism from some listeners that I have too many people on from AEI, which I disagree with. I would say I've only had like 5% of AEI on this podcast. But he's no longer at AEI, so I am immune to this criticism now. I'm talking about Ken Pollack. He's now the vice president for policy at the Middle East Institute. He's also worked in a number of agencies and institutions in the government that are all known by 3-letter acronyms, but we don't need to get into the details. And I said 3-letter, so it wasn't OSHA, if you get my drift. And he's the author of a great number of books, all about Iran, Iraq, the Middle East, national security, and whatnot. And of course, Ken Pollack, it's great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back, Jonah. And please point out to Brett Devereaux, I'm passing him on the list here.
I guess that's right. Yeah. Although you have much work to catch up with Chris Direwalt, who has been on 28 times or something. Okay, so I know you're carrying a lot of receipts for my recent comments about modernization and Alexander the Great and Leo Strauss and whatnot, and we're going to put all those aside for the moment and talk about what the hell is happening in Iran, or in Israel, in the Middle East, however we want to phrase this. What's your big picture 30,000 foot take on just setting the scene? How do you see it?
Sure. So let me start with the point that you made beforehand, Jonah, which is that you're right. I was always skeptical about an Israeli strike. I remain skeptical about it. And the way that I see things right now, first, the Israeli campaign seems to be going extremely well, which is exactly what I expected. The Israelis are tactically brilliant. And, they come up with stuff that no one would ever think of before, let alone the ability to do it. My God, the fact that they were able to build a drone base outside of Tehran, right, and launch many of their attacks from this drone base is just phenomenal, right? They are absolutely superb at this kind of thing. But there are much bigger issues out there. And my concern about an Israeli strike, and it wasn't, again, I was never opposed to taking out Iran's nuclear arsenal. My concern about it was whether the Israelis could do it in such a way that they would not end up with a worse scenario down the road, right? That's right. Always my consideration, because we need to recognize wars are not, the purpose of a war is not to defeat the enemy. The purpose of a war is to get to a better situation at the end of the war. Defeating the enemy is often, most of the time, a necessary condition for it. It's never sufficient. And even there have been wars in history where you didn't even need the winner, the ultimate winner, the country that proved victorious in the long term may not necessarily have even defeated the other side. Right, so the Israelis are doing exceptionally well tactically, which is what I always expected. I'm glad to talk about it, but I do expect that there's just a whole bunch of other things that the Israelis are planning to get to that we just haven't seen yet. And so I think there are people saying, well, what about this and what about that? I think those are all reasonable questions. I suspect the Israelis already have answers to those questions. My great concern is the longer term. My great concern is about whether the results of this war mean that there is never an Iranian nuclear weapon, or whether the Israelis have ultimately guaranteed that there will be an Iranian nuclear weapon. That's my great concern. And that is an open question, because that is going to be about what happens during this war and after, and glad to unpack that stuff with you.
Yeah, no, we should get to that. I mean, and let's just sort of lay it out. Your argument has always been, I remember this because you agreed with my extended metaphor, which I'm always terrified I'm not going to stick the landing on, that the Iranian nuclear program is more like a plane that has reached the destination, but it's circling the airport. And if it needs to, it could put it down right away and have a nuclear plant. And it's rather than a plane en route to the destination of having a nuclear bomb, um, it had the last steps it could put together. And so in the current climate, the argument is, and so then the second part of the argument was, if you go after Iran and all you do is set it back a bit, you signal to Iran that it needs to put it together, because like there are people in Iran right now, I'm sure, are saying, if we had a nuclear bomb right now,
Exactly.
Israel wouldn't be doing this. And so when the smoke clears and they come up for air, the absolute necessity of getting a nuclear bomb right away kicks in. I get that. At the same time, do you think that Israel was? What do you make? I mean, first of all, unpack any parts of the stuff that you laid out in the beginning, but also, do you think there's a lot of talk about preemption, which is different than prevention, right? And all that, but there is talk. I have not seen well corroborated talk that Iran was in this mode of putting it all together, and Israel struck. I don't get the sense that that's. I don't know, but I don't get the sense that that's all that persuasive at this point. What do you make of those arguments that the timing was doing this now was necessary to stop them from getting it? Has any new facts entered this to make you rethink that position?
No. But I think this is a great question, and it is worth unpacking a little bit. So I think what we saw was there was a harmonic convergence for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for Bibi Netanyahu, to do this, right? I mean, you look across the number of different factors that seem to fall into place in terms of the Israelis having devastated Hezbollah. So there was no threat that Hezbollah could retaliate for an Israeli strike, right? You had an American president who was going to be very permissive about Israeli military operations. You had Ayatollah Khamenei still in place, and I think that is important for the Israelis, because Khamenei, again, I want to be a little bit careful about this, but the simple fact is that over the course of his, at this point in time, 27 years in power, he's actually been quite prudent and quite strategic in his thinking. Right, that too has been important. The situation in the region, the way that the ongoing operations in Gaza, every single thing you can think of, just worked out perfectly to make this the perfect window for Israel to mount a strike. Right, it worked out perfectly for the Israelis to do so. Now, as for the justifications that in particular Netanyahu is offering, I mean, first, Jonah, I wonder, as I was sitting and listening to it, I kept thinking to myself, wow, this speech sounds awfully Bushian. And I mean George W. Bush.
Yeah.
It sounds really like the arguments that you heard from the George W. Bush administration before the invasion of Iraq. And my feeling about those speeches was that they were never lies, right? But what they were very serious exaggerations, right? So you never had anyone say anything that was truly wrong, not intentionally. But what they always did was they simply left out the parts that were inconvenient for them and only stressed the worst case scenarios. On this, I listened very closely to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and his comments about this threat from Iran were extremely vague. And I think if you parse them, they sound like Iran is about to do something to Israel, but that's not literally what he's saying. And yes, as you're pointing out, I've not seen anything. The Israelis have not offered anything, nor have I heard from anyone in the US government that, yes, they believe that there was a new imminence to the Iranian nuclear threat to Israel. There's always been a belief, and again, different intelligence communities have different reads on this, that the Iranians were continuing to make progress toward a nuclear weapon. And we knew about the stuff they were doing with uranium enrichment. The bigger issue, the bigger question mark out there was the actual bomb design part of it, right? Nuclear weapon, you need two things. You need the fissile material, and you need the actual bomb design, the bomb itself, the thing
Right.
that explodes. And then, of course, you also want some kind of a delivery system. But the truth is, you can put even a crude nuclear weapon into a semi or a freighter. You park that off Tel Aviv, it achieves the same thing as a ballistic missile coming in. So these are the two big parts. We know about the fissile material, and what Netanyahu has been suggesting is that there is going to be some kind of an acceleration there. But again, if you parse his words, it's very vague, right? It's kind of at some point this may happen. On the actual nuclear weapons side, again, everyone believes the Iranians have been making some progress. The truth is, most intelligence communities, I would say, including the Israelis, felt that was actually going very, very slowly. And again, Netanyahu implied that it was going to speed up, but he doesn't actually say that. Right? So again, it felt like that same kind of a Bush, I'm going to exaggerate the threat without really saying something that's wrong.
Right. So I just want to push back on that in the slightest bit. I mean, I get the point that you're making. There's a different, and I think it's entirely fair about the imminence argument, right? That I think you're probably right on. But unlike with Iraq, there is no doubt, right? And we know it from Iranian officials that they are building a nuclear program, right? I mean, like with Iraq, it was always that he's doing it in secret, and he's got these WMDs, and he hasn't cooperated with UN inspectors, and the Bush administration, I agree with you, leaned heavily, almost on a prosecutor's brief, of leaving out all the inconvenient, contrary points, which is what prosecutors do, right? And the rest is a sad tale that we don't need to revisit. But the analogy, so while I think the analogy works on the imminence thing about, like, we don't necessarily have concrete evidence that they were down to, like, okay, now we just have to attach the green wire and it's operative. Like, we have no evidence of that I've seen. But we have scads of evidence, including the Iranian regime's own testimony, that they're working on this, that I don't think there's an intelligence agency in the world that disagrees that they're working on this, right? And even if you were going to say, well, they could be lying about this, you're a former national security official. Like, you kind of have to take bad guys or existential enemies who say death to America and death to Israel, and we are going to wipe out the Zionist entity at their word when they say they're actually working on a nuclear program. So the imminence thing I agree with, but I think the analogy kind of breaks down a little bit with Saddam on the rest of it. No?
So the only thing I might disagree with in what you said is I actually think the Iraq case is a little stronger than you're suggesting. And I got a new book that's coming out next year, and I hope you'll have me on and we'll talk about that.
I can promise you that.
On the Iran piece of it, you are absolutely correct, right? And I don't want to suggest otherwise. Let's be very clear about this. Iran's program is a nuclear weapons program, period, full stop. That's all it's about.
Right.
The Iranians, for some period of time, would say that it was about nuclear energy. Occasionally, they say that too. But there is no one on the planet who actually believes that. I mean, first of all, they've been claiming that for 20 years. Right. You know how many nuclear reactors they've brought online during that 20-year period? Exactly, none. Right? Yeah. There's no effort to actually build nuclear energy. And what's more, the Israelis captured Iran's entire nuclear archive, right? All the documents about it were being stored in this warehouse in Tehran. The Israelis captured the entire archive and moved it back to Israel, right? And
just out of curious, I'm a layman, but in intelligence circles, that's considered bad, right, for the Iranians. I mean, like someone got fired because of that. I'm assuming.
Presumably, yes.
Okay.
But yes, this is very bad for the Iranians. And by the way, it's something worth thinking about. Just how good Mossad is.
Yeah.
I mean, my God! Again, as you pointed out, I worked for some three-letter agencies in the past. You know, my experience is that the Iranians have rolled up the American intelligence network in Iran,
Mm-hmm.
focused on the Iranians, at least three times in my lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they kind of did it effortlessly. And when you look at what Mossad has been able, just almost literally running rings around them, it's just stunning, right? And this was just another unbelievable intelligence coup by the Israelis to get this entire archive. So yeah, we know exactly what the Iranian, and by the way, there was no doubt even before the Israelis did
Sure.
this. Right? I wrote a book
Right.
in 2013 about the Iranian nuclear program, and I just laid out all the evidence. Like there's no way to defend this as anything but a nuclear weapons program. That is clear. And in fact, I would say even the worst apologists for the Iranians stopped trying to make that argument years ago.
Right.
And now they'll argue for, well, why Iran would need a nuclear weapon.
All right. So, just on the, I want to come back to that point because I think it's because it, for those sympathetic to Israel, or for many people sympathetic to Israel, that means that the opportunity presented by the moment is a justification, even if the claims of imminence aren't, right?
Right.
But I just, because I'm afraid I won't circle back to this to have it as a parentheses later. The quality of the Mossad's intelligence in Israel, I think we all know they're good with the computers and the doodads and all that kind of stuff. But how much of that has to do with the fact that there was a large Iranian Jewish population in Israel, and that you've got people who can speak? I mean, like, what Mossad must have really impressive human assets on the ground in Iran. No, I mean, can you do all of that just with satellites and computer hacking, or don't you have to have like some serious, undercover in Mufti people, whether they're on payroll or they're actually Israelis undercover? Like, do you have any visibility on all that? Because I'm just sort of fascinated by it.
Very little. And look, the answer I can give you is probably.
Yeah.
But the truth is, Jonah, this is the point: is they are so good at this that no one knows how they're doing this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, it looks like it is this brilliant combination and synergy of people on the ground, of computer work, of data analysis, of technical systems. I will say that I've had people say to me, yes, they are making use of the Iranian Jewish community, the Iranian Jewish diaspora, and the little bit that's left in. The truth is, my sense is the little bit left in Iran has no role really to play.
Yeah, that would shock me.
Yeah.
Like they're not putting Jewish or Iranian Jews in positions of national security importance, right? I mean, that would shock me.
And the remnant there, to use a phrase, is very, very small. And truthfully, they're very frightened also.
Sure.
I don't think any of them would try to do it. But, it is worth pointing out that you've got a lot of Iranians who hate their governments. We never have good public opinion numbers on that. But just given how frequently the Iranian population revolts against its government, tries to start a new revolution, pretty much every 2 to 4 years, you get a mass protest movement against this regime. There are clearly a lot of people there who hate their government. And even now, in social media, and to the extent that we can hear it, there are a lot of Iranians who are either happy about what's going on or just feel like this is the regime's fault. They brought it on themselves. I mean, we need to be careful about that. People who are getting bombed tend to not like the people who are bombing them.
For sure.
But again, we're getting enough complex reactions to this to suggest that, again, there's just deep-seated public animosity toward this regime, which also creates opportunity for the Israelis to recruit agents inside of Iran.
Okay, so back before that parentheses. So even if the imminence argument is unpersuasive,
Mhm.
the opportunity, like this opportunity will not come again, right? Because it used to be that the whole argument, not the whole argument, but an important part of the argument against doing this is that Iran's proxies and Hezbollah and Hamas um, could be, that Syria would, you know, they could put
Right.
boots on the ground, as it were, in Israel and create real problems with terrorist attacks and rocket and mortar fire from three different sides and all that kind of stuff. And because all that stuff was neutralized, and who knows if it's going to be neutralized for long, um, you have, they have a nuclear program, and because of the conflict that the last time you were on, we talked about, they took out a remarkable amount of their air defenses, and this is the moment, right? So, what is the argument about against seize? What is the source of skepticism about seizing this moment?
Sure. So, first, just to add a little bit to what you said, that point about Syria is an important one. And you're right, it's another element of what makes this time perfect for them, because, best I can tell, old military analyst here, they're overflying Syria. That's
Right,
how they're getting there. So, that's another piece
which is
that makes it
huge,
perfect.
right?
Exactly. It is
Yeah.
huge. It was always a problem in the past. And the fall of the Assad regime and the fact that you now have no Russian air defenses and no Syrian air defense system to speak of has opened up Syria's airspace for the Israelis to fly through. Okay, but to your real question there, um, here's the problem. What really matters in all of this is the circumstances 3, 5, 10 years down the road. Will this regime end up with a nuclear weapon? Right? And let me start with the history. That's where I start from. I'm just one of
Mm-hmm.
these, dumb reality-based analysts who,
Mm-hmm.
has to look at things that have actually happened, right? So 3 times the Israelis have tried to stop an enemy nuclear weapons program. Iraq in 1981, when they bombed the Osirak reactor in Tuatha, Iraq. 2007, when they bombed the Syrian reactor at Al Kibar, and then 2010, when we and they combined on the Stuxnet virus to try to stop the Iranian nuclear program or hinder it as best we could. The one that worked, the only one that really worked, I guess Iraq's complicated, but the one that really worked was the Syrian one. The Syrians didn't rebuild their reactor afterwards, and ultimately Syria never got a nuclear weapon. But Syria never got a nuclear weapon, frankly, because the Syrian civil war intervened, right? And so at that moment, Bashar al-Assad's options narrowed enormously. He couldn't rebuild the Syrian nuclear program. In the case of Iraq, again, you get something similar, but it's luck. Because what happens after the Osirak attack, and this is not the mythology, but this is the reality, because we now know this from everything that we learned about the Iraq program after 1991, after the Gulf War, when the inspectors went in there and got access to all this, and then what we learned after 2003 and the invasion, and we suddenly got access to all of Iraq's documentation and all of its scientists. It is very clear what happens after 1981 does not set back the Iraqi nuclear program, it accelerates it. Saddam is so furious that the Israelis have bombed the Osirak reactor that he pours resources into their nuclear program. The nuclear program had been kind of trundling along, right? Wasn't making a whole lot of progress before then. Saddam, again, he wanted a nuclear weapon, no question. And by the way, he wanted a nuclear weapon to use against Israel.
Mm-hmm.
No question about that. We've got him on tape saying it any number of times. But it's not a priority for him. After the Israeli strike, it becomes a priority. And the mythology, the argument that many people believe, which turns out to be incorrect, is this idea that it's so good that the Israelis struck Iraq in 1981, because if they hadn't done so, Saddam would have had a nuclear weapon in 1990 when he invaded Kuwait, and we would never have been able to do the Gulf War. What we learned after the fact was that was wrong, that it's really lucky that Saddam was stupid enough to invade Kuwait in 1990 before he had a nuclear weapon, because he probably would have had one between 1992 and 1995, somewhere in that time frame. And if he had waited, the invasion of Kuwait would have looked completely different, probably wouldn't have been a Gulf War. But the issue is, after the 81 strike, the Israeli strike in 81, Saddam massively increases his program. And that's more or less what happens with the 2010 Stuxnet attack as well. Now, the Iranians are already trying to get a nuclear weapon. Again, I don't want to say otherwise, and they're already investing a lot in it. But after the Stuxnet attack, again, what we understand now, they actually pour more resources into their nuclear program at that point in time. And they do things like build the Ferdo facility, right? They start going deeper underground. They start to disperse their nuclear program more so. So this is the problem going forward. My guess is the Israelis are going to do an enormous amount of damage to the Iranian nuclear program. That was always my expectation. Truthfully, I was always more optimistic about the strike itself than many of the people who were more enthusiastic about the idea of Israel striking. My concern is what happens afterwards. My concern is that, like the Iraqis in 81, like themselves in 2010, that the Iranian response will be, as you just put it a moment ago, Jonah, this is why we have to have nuclear weapons. And they will, at the end of this, decide, as they have threatened to do in the past, to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, announce that they are building nuclear weapons, dare us, the Israelis, and everyone else to stop them, and they will build large numbers of enrichment facilities all over the country. And again, we can go into some of the technicalities, but they've got a lot of centrifuges that we don't even know where the hell they are. They now know how to enrich. They have highly enriched uranium they could convert very, very quickly. They also have lots of uranium feedstock. So it would be very much a challenge to prevent them from acquiring a nuclear weapon in the future if they really wanted to do so. And from my perspective, right now, that's what we have to be thinking about. I will also say, I know that the Israelis understand everything that I've just said to you. They've been thinking about it. I think that what I'm already seeing from how this campaign is unrolling, a lot of it looks to me like the Israelis have thought about it. And a number of the things they're doing now are really about trying to get at that problem.
Okay, so just some low-hanging fruit of some technical questions.
Good.
There's a lot of talk about, let's forget the should or shouldn't we stuff for a second. There's a lot of talk about how Israel needs these massive bunker buster bombs that they don't have the B-52s or the whatever the bombers to carry, and they don't have the bunker busters. And so one of the questions is whether we should provide them or whether we should rent them, to the Israelis, which is very Trumpy, or whether we should do it ourselves. So we'll get to that in a second.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I think it was the defense editor of The Economist, I can't remember who, was making the point that a lot of the scenarios for why Israel can't do this itself were premised on the idea that Israel would not get complete air dominance in Iran to do it. But if you have complete air dominance, you can just keep dropping smaller bombs over and over and over again that add up to the same effect as bigger bombs, or something to that along those lines. I mean, as you've suggested, there's simply no way Israel doesn't have an answer to the question, how are you going to take out Fardo? They wouldn't do it. But am I right that internally in Israel, you couldn't get a green light on this without having an answer that satisfied that question for a lot of people? So what do you think Israel needs to do to take out Fardo? What do you think? And then we can get to what do you think we should do to help or not help them get it?
Sure. So again, I think this is a great question, and I find myself absolutely in agreement with you. I think you've read it correctly, which is Israel would not have embarked on this war if they did not have an answer for Ferdo. Ferdo is a hard target. There is no question about that. And look, it might fail. There's not a certainty that whatever Israel has in mind that it will work. But I have absolutely no doubt that they have thought through Ferdo. Right?
Hey, so why don't you explain just very quickly for listeners who may not know?
Sure.
What is Fardo?
So Ferdo is a large Iranian facility within a mountain just south of Tehran, near the holy city of Qom. It is primarily a uranium enrichment facility. It's not their biggest enrichment facility. That's the Natanz facility, which again, you've probably heard about. And the Israelis bombed Natanz already. Probably could do some more damage there, but they've done a lot of damage to Natanz already. But Ferdo is buried deep inside a mountain, right? And it is very tough to get at Ferdo with conventional bombs. Pretty much no one believes that the munitions that Israel possesses can penetrate deep enough to get at Ferdo. And it's not just that it's inside of a mountain, it's also that it's built with enormous amounts of concrete around it, right? So this is a very, very tough facility to bomb. And as you point out, Jonah, the United States has a munition. It's called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the MOP. We believe that the MOP can probably get to Ferdo, but even that is unclear, right? It was built to get at exactly these kinds of things, but you can't be certain about that. And Israel does not have the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. They don't have any of the MOPs. What's more, you need a B-2 bomber or B-52 bomber to deliver a MOP. And the Israelis, of course, don't have the B-2. And let's also recognize the B-2 is an incredibly complex aircraft to fly. You can't just take an F-15 pilot, stick him or her in a B-2 and say, go fly this and deliver the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. They're going to have to learn how to fly the B-2. Now, again, Israel has extraordinarily capable pilots. I have no doubt they will find some people who will learn how to fly a B-2 fairly quickly, but it's not going to happen, by lunch.
You just can't give them the keys and say, go ahead. Right.
Right.
Make sure you fill it up when you return it.
Right. But back to your first question, as hard as Ferdo is, I have no doubt that the Israelis have an answer for Ferdo. And it may not be bombing, right? I'm constantly, I read one newspaper article after another where they say, well, the Israelis can't get at Ferdo because they don't, unless they get the MOP, unless they get a B-2. That's one way of taking out Ferdo. There may well be other ways. The Israelis may be thinking about it in terms of cyber strikes, right, or a combination of cyber strikes and kinetic operations. I will tell you, I suspect that the Israelis, I'll put it this way, at the very least, I think that the Israelis have done a lot of thinking and planning for how you might take out Ferdo using special forces. I think you and I talked about this last time I was on. They did an operation against a facility in northern Syria before the fall of the Assad regime, located deep inside a mountain in northern Syria that they hit with special forces. And they took the whole facility out. And I looked at that, and I know a number of other Middle East military analysts looked at that and said, that was about Ferdo. Right. This was either a rehearsal for Ferdo or it was a signal to the Iranians, don't think Ferdo is safe. Right. We have an answer for Ferdo. So, it may be that they're thinking about special forces. Honestly, Jonah, they may have come up with something that none of us ever thought of before.
Right.
And I said, they're capable of doing this stuff. None of us would have thought of the Operation Grim Beeper, as my friend Mike Duran likes to call it, the Beeper attack against Hezbollah. It may also be, and worth throwing this out there because it gets to the question you're raising. It may be that their answer to Ferdo is, we're going to find a way to get the Americans into this war and let them take care of Ferdo. That strikes me as unlikely. Again, the Israelis might hope that that's going to happen. But again, I can't imagine that they went into this war assuming that their answer for Ferdo was that the Americans will take it out, right?
I buy it could be a plan B.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of thing, right? It's like, well, if we can't get the Americans to do it, here's what we do. But like the idea that they didn't have that alternative makes no sense to me.
Yep. I don't think they would have done that if they weren't planning on having a good plan for how they get Ferdo themselves. And again, the fact that they haven't taken a shot, maybe they've taken a small shot at Ferdo, that means nothing to me. Again, this may be about doing everything else that they need to do to set the conditions for whatever it is that they're planning to do at Ferdo.
And just so I understand, so doing it with special forces means a bunch of dudes go in, take out the guards, go inside, set charges or whatever it is, and do it action movie style, right? I mean, that's
Correct.
basically it. Yeah.
Exactly. And by the way, we know the Israelis have all the plans for Ferdo
Right.
because that was part of that archive, that treasure trove of documents that they grabbed from Tehran in 2018. So they know what Ferdo looks like.
Right. Although Iranians know that Israelis know, so they may have, put up some drywall or something. But I take your point. Um, uh, okay, so I've been very busy, and I've only been tuning in and out of some of this stuff, and I feel like I know why a lot of Iran's air defenses are screwed up. I remember from the thing in last year. I get why Israel went after political leadership and all that kind of stuff. Get all that. I feel like I went to go get popcorn when the Iranian Air Force disappeared. Like, do they have planes, but they know they can't go up without their air defense radar systems? That they're basically just it's a meat assault against the Israelis. What happened to their Air Force again? I can't remember.
So yeah, they have an Air Force, but it's crappy, right? And that's a technical term. I can explain that to your listeners.
That's an acronym, right? Anyway, capable, reduced, whatever. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's good, Jonah. But yeah, look, it's crappy. And look, again, at the end of the day, we obviously don't know exactly why they didn't fly it, but I think that it's highly likely that they simply recognize you put planes in the air, the Israelis are just going to shoot them down.
Yeah.
Right. And let's recognize these planes are expensive. And the Iranians might probably do look at these planes and say, we're not going to use these against Israel. That makes no sense. But we could use them against other countries, right? It could be very useful if we ever decide to attack Azerbaijan, right? Or, Kazakhstan, right?
Or to protect the regime against the popular,
yes, something like
uprising.
That.
Yeah,
right? So again, there are other uses for these. They're expensive, right? The ones that are operational, probably they don't seem, like they do have. There was a report the other day that the Israelis bombed one of the Iranian F-14s, right? And my immediate reaction to that was, oh God, that's such a shame, right? Because operational F-14, it may not even be operational. These are like museum pieces, and really that that F-14 deserved to be in somebody's Air Force museum, even Iran's Air Force museum somewhere. That's really a shame that but that's all it's good for. Right. Yeah. These are planes that were built in the 1970s. They were magnificent aircraft back then, but the U.S. Navy retired them all 20 years ago. Right, because they are so obsolete. And of course, Iranian F-14s are not maintained nearly as well as U.S. Navy F-14s. So whether that thing could have even gotten off the ground, whether it had a working radar, whether it had missiles that it could actually fire, these are not terribly useful. And then they've got a smaller number of both Russian-built and even some French-built planes, which they captured from the Iraqis. Remember during the Gulf War, Saddam had the same problem. If I put up my Air Force, the Americans shoot them down. If I leave them on the ground, the Americans blow them up. So what am I going to do? I'm going to send them to Iran, right? Again, one of my favorite moments of recent military history.
That was such a weird moment. I remember that.
One of my favorite moments of the Gulf War. Just supreme idiocy. Saddam handing his Air Force to the Iranians. But again, the Iranians aren't going to fly him against the Israelis. They're just going to get shot down.
Right.
There's no real point. I suspect they've probably flown a few just to complicate Israel's operations. But my sense is not many at all, if any.
Yeah. Okay. So I raised it very obliquely there for a second. I think we got to talk about. Well, all right. So before we get to the regime change question, should we give Israel our mop? Should we lend them stuff? Should we do the Lend-Lease? You're hearing Lend-Lease come up a lot all of a sudden, or should we do it ourselves as a way to sort of underscore the fact that we actually mean it when we say regimes like this can't get nuclear weapons? How do you think about it?
Sure. So I got to first set aside the kind of weirdness of the Trump administration, right? Because what Donald Trump is going to do, who the heck knows, right? That's got to be set aside a little bit here. And here's where I want to start. Again, we have the same, now that Israel has done this, now that we're in this, we have the same interests that Israel does, right? We do not want the Iranians to reconstitute their nuclear program. And that's what we've got to be fixated on. And, first, I think that the Trump administration and Trump himself, there is some right in what he is doing, right? Mm-hmm. So the best answer to that is, at the end of this war, we get the Iranians to sign a new deal in which they say, yes, we agree we'll never have nuclear weapons. We will get rid of all of the program. We will only have, at all civilian nuclear plants. They will be complete, they'll be inspected by the IAEA. There'll be no enrichment, none of this other stuff, right? You want to have nuclear power, fine, but it's going to have to be completely controlled, contained, etc. That's actually the best answer from it. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that what President Trump is doing in his own inimitable way probably is right now, in the sense that the best thing that the U.S. can do is hold itself out as a reasonably neutral mediator, right? So as long as we are not seen as actively taking the side of the Israelis, it would probably be easier for the Iranians to come back to us and say, okay, we get it. We just got our butts kicked. Doesn't make sense for us to do this again. We're willing to sign a deal, but they're not going to sign it with the Israelis, right? Fine, we'll sign it with you Americans. And in return, we get something, right? There needs to be something face-saving for them, so we get the lifting of sanctions, right? And I actually do think that that is the best course of action out there. Second point, if that's not going to work, if that's not going to be possible, the next best course, the next best way to handle this is you want to make it clear to the Iranians that if they go about reconstituting, next time is going to be worse, right? So, this is bad, and whenever this ends, it's going to end badly for the Iranians, right? The Iranians are taking an absolute hammering. This is a huge loss for them. But if they come out of it and decide we're going to reconstitute our nuclear program, then there has to be something worse waiting for them then, right? And the obvious worse is the United States will join the war next time around, right? You thought it was bad when you were just getting, your hide beaten by the Israelis. Wait till you see what happens when the United States joins, right? And so again, that's another scenario where it's better for the United States not to have gotten involved in this. Now, there's one other piece to this that is worth talking about. And again, I think this is one of the things that the Israelis are already thinking about, because again, they can't predict what the United States is doing. So there's kind of a variant of that second scenario, which is that the worse that you're going to get next time is we kill all your political leaders. Right. I am very much of the opinion, I think the Israelis are being smart and strategic about this, that the decision not to kill Khamenei. And I know there's a news story out there saying that Netanyahu asked Trump that if he could do this. Netanyahu himself has more or less disavowed this. Might be right. Even if Netanyahu asked it, I'm not certain that he would have done it. Because again, everything that I see from the Israelis is that they are deliberately not killing Iran's political leadership. They're going after Iran's military leadership. They're going after its weapons scientists, right? Those are two discrete categories. But there are lots of Iranian political leaders who, look, if they can kill their military leaders, I think there's a pretty high probability that they could kill a lot, maybe all of the political leaders, because the political leaders tend to be much more lax about their security, right? So if you wanted to kill their political leadership, and this also speaks to, a lot of people are out there saying, the Israelis are trying for regime change. I think the Israelis would love to bring about regime change, but I don't think they actually are trying to do it. Because again, if that were a main goal of Israel's, they would have started by killing Khamenei. Right. And then Pezeshkian, the president, and then you go after the Larajanis, who are head of the parliament, head of the judiciary. Right? There are a lot of Iranian political leaders. You start killing those people, the whole place starts to come apart. So that's the route to regime change. And again, that's also what the regime cares about, right? They care about their own safety and security. So, another thing that, another scenario where what is even worse than what Israel is doing now is a war where Israel goes after the political leadership right away. I think that's what the Israelis are saying. I suspect they're already back channeling this to the Iranians, which is, we haven't killed your political leadership now, but if you decide to reconstitute, we will go after it, right? The third scenario is, this is where the U.S. comes in. And from my perspective, yeah, if you can't get either of the first two scenarios, then we absolutely do have to come in on Israel's side. Because as I said, we do not want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. That would be the worst possible outcome. And let's also note, there's really no one out there who does want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. I mean, I know I'm exaggerating a little bit. The North Koreans may want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. Maybe the Venezuelans. I'm sure that
Tucker Carlson. But yeah.
To pick a name, right?
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of countries in the world do not want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. They've made it very clear. That's how Obama was able to get the UN Resolution 1929, where he got comprehensive sanctions imposed on Iran back in 2010, and the Russians signed on to it, and the Chinese signed on to it, and the Europeans signed on to it, because nobody wants Iran to get nuclear weapons. So, if we needed to, again, this is not something that would be ultimately unpopular in the sense of nobody wants Iran to get nuclear weapons. Now, how we did it, how we got into it, yeah, people will always complain about that. But that's, again, why better, first and foremost, for the United States to be the mediator and get Iran to sign a deal not to. And then secondly, to be, again, this fist held in reserve. If you go down this path, there is something worse waiting for you to do it, to deter them from going down that route. Only if we think those two other things won't apply, those are the circumstances that I'd say, yeah, if we're not going to get those two outcomes, then by God, yes, we ought to pile on with the Israelis right now. And again, a part of that too, Jonah, is the point that you and I were just talking about. I think the Israelis do have a plan for Fordo, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think they actually need the B-2s and the MOPS. I don't think they would have started this if they didn't have that plan. So from my perspective, it makes it less necessary for the U.S. to do that. Right? But that's how I think about all of this stuff.
Just out of curiosity, of those scenarios, what's the one that Saudi Arabia wants the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the one that Saudi Arabia wants the most is actually the third scenario. Mm-hmm. Right? Because ultimately what the Saudis want is they want not just an end to the Iranian nuclear program, they want an end to this regime. Mm-hmm. And I think that they believe that the most likely way that you get an end to this regime is with that third scenario, where the U.S. comes in on top of it, right? And we're bombing everything, right? And under those circumstances, again, I can spin out a lot of sub scenarios for how you would actually, how regime change is even more. I mean, again, I think there are possibilities for regime change in all these scenarios. I think it's the third set of scenarios that is the by far most likely to produce regime change. That's what the Saudis want. And by the way, you were talking about the desire to sit around and watch this eating a bowl of popcorn. Mm-hmm. That's literally how I've been describing what the Saudi royal family has been up to in all of this. Yeah. They did issue a perfunctory condemnation of the Israeli attack. I think they love this. I think they're absolutely gleeful about this.
One of my reporters at the Dispatch was saying how their contacts, they were talking to some foreign policy people who were saying that the Saudis don't like the instability because they want to be more of a normal country and more of a hub for, this, that, and the other thing. I'm not sure I buy that, but I thought it was an interesting response. So just for a second, let's assume that Bibi, in fact, did want to kill Khamenei. What is the reaction in the region to that? I mean, also, what is the reaction inside of Iran? I mean, I know, we know there are a lot of people who hate the regime. We know there are a lot of people who are sick and tired of the theocracy. But we also know a lot of people show up to those rallies and very enthusiastically chant death to America. So I feel like maybe it's a 60-40 issue, but Iraq is full of Shia, and uh, how destabilizing, how enraging is that in the wider Middle East if the Jews took out, the head mullah of Shia Islam?
Yeah, and you put that nicely.
Yeah,
It's the Jooz Jews.
that's right.
So you're getting at two different pieces of it really nicely. So one piece of it is they just killed the head of state of
Hmm.
a country. And again, I think what you'll see in the region is uh, not divided opinion so much as torn opinion, right? Because most people in the region will be delighted to see the Iranian regime collapse, see it go the way of the dodo. But I think that you're right that they will be very concerned about the precedent. That if Israel can kill Khamenei, they can kill pretty much anybody, right? Anybody that they don't like. And let's also recognize there's a bigger question for us, for all of us, right, about where warfare is headed. I actually wrote a piece with my friend Dan Byman long before any of this started, talking about uh, these assassinations, in effect, directed killings. You know, right now, we and the Israelis have the capability to do this stuff. Very few other countries do. That's changing really quickly. So
Hmm.
you start setting the precedent of killing another side's political leaders, it's open season, right? You can put a bunch of drones on a boat off the coast of the United States and, go after Pete Hegseth, when he's coming back from a bar at night. You can come after Donald Trump, at Mar-a-Lago. This is all going to be out there in the future, and we should be thinking about it more. The problem is right now, as I said, we and the Israelis have the ability to do this in a way that our enemies really can't, but that's changing very quickly. And back to your original question, again, you'll have people in the region who are very concerned about that, about the precedent that it sets. We saw something similar when the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani, who was the
Right.
number two in Iran, the general who was in charge of their Quds force back in 2020. We assassinated him when he showed up in, targeted killing. We don't assassinate.
That's
We
right.
targeted killed him in 2020 when he landed in Iraq. So that's one set of issues. And yeah, again, I think the region will be very, very torn. Then there is this question also about, okay, what would either instability or regime collapse in Iran mean for other countries in the region? And I think the truth is, for most other countries in the region, that's a great thing. Again, I do not, I'm not sure who your friend is. Yeah, there certainly are Saudis who will say we don't like instability. That's certainly true. But at the end of the day, certainly their leadership understands Iran is their enemy.
Yeah.
Iran does not mean them well. And if they could be rid of this regime, they absolutely would want to do so. But the problem is, you take out this regime, you don't know what comes next. So first point is, most people, the bet would be that you'll get a even nastier Revolutionary Guard controlled regime. Again, Khamenei is not a nice man. I do not
Hmm.
like this person, but at the end of the day, he's proven to be mostly pretty prudent and a strategic thinker. There are plenty of Revolutionary Guard commanders who are just wild hotheads. And, if they were in power, we'd probably be going back and saying, wish we could have Khamenei back again. The other possibility is Iran comes apart at the seams, right? And, you get Iraq after our invasion, right? Where, again, we didn't bother to actually put the number of troops we needed in there to secure the country. And so you get chaos and civil war. Now, that would be very, very bad for the countries that border Iran. Okay. Less so for other countries, but civil wars have a bad habit of spilling over. As you point out, Iraq would be in a very bad way. Worth noting, the vast majority of Iraqis, I mean the vast majority of Iraqis, including those Iraqis who are most closely allied with Iran, they hate the Iranians, right? You scratch an Iranian, an Iraqi, and what you will get is, oh God, these are the Persians. We hate the Persians. Forget about the Sunni Shia thing. That's not the issue for them. It's the Persian Arab thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the Iraqi Sunni community fought against Iran all through the Iran-Iraq war. But nonetheless, there are a lot of Iraqi Shia who are indebted to Iran, right? Who rely on Iran. Their protector is now gone. They will be frightened. What's more, again, civil war simply spills over borders. And Iraq is already a fragile state. The Iraqis, I know, are very, very concerned about those kinds of scenarios. And could it push Iraq back into civil war, right? Turkey will be concerned. Turkmenistan will be concerned. Pakistan will be concerned. And at some level, I do.
The Kurds could be psyched, though, right? I mean, like,
yeah, short term, yes, because it will be an opportunity for them to declare independence. But they too will wind up worrying about,
sure.
Does this ignite another Kurdish Arab or Kurdish Turkish conflict as a result of it? And so, that has always been a consideration. And, I will tell you, lots of Americans, Europeans, other folks who've looked at this, it's one of the reasons that they too have opposed an Israeli strike against Iran, because of the uncertainties involved, and could it somehow get to regime change? Again, I don't see that as likely unless the Israelis, or we and the Israelis, start to try to go after the political leadership. And by the way, there's a whole bunch of other targets out there that you'd want to, if you really wanted to bring about regime change in Iran, there's a whole bunch of other targets you'd want to go after, all the Revolutionary Guard and besieged facilities that keep the regime in place. You might actually try to go after civilian infrastructure to cause greater chaos. It's why, again, when I look at what the Israelis are doing, I do not see a deliberate regime change campaign. Again, I think if it happened, the Israelis would be fine with it, but I don't think that they're purposely trying to bring it about. In this case, mostly, again, because they want to hold that in reserve as a warning to the Iranians. As bad as this is, it could get so much worse if you guys do X, Y, and Z, X of which is probably rebuild your nuclear program.
Okay. In the time we got left, and I could really go much longer, but I got to get on a train to New York, so that's life. But so I think it was on Air Force One. A reporter asked Donald Trump about comments that Tulsi Gabbard had made, the director of national intelligence, had made back in March, and about Iran and its nuclear program and whatever. And Trump said, I don't care what she said. I think they're close to getting a bomb, and we have to stop them from getting a bomb. Now, I am a fairly well-established critic of Donald Trump. I am very happy, and I want to praise him for not caring about what Tulsi Gabbard has to say. And I actually think I think there's a lot of post hoc spin about how he's rope-a-doped the Iranians and this was his plan all along and yada, yada, yada. I'll leave that to future historians, or at least future, journalists to get to later. But I think at the margins, Trump has been on the right side of a lot of this stuff, and he's not listened. And I very much like it when he throws Tucker Carlson under the bus. So that's all great. But as you said a few minutes ago, you have to put aside the weirdness of the Trump administration. Is there, I feel like if this was the British government and a prime minister said, I don't care what my director of national intelligence, whatever that job would be there, I don't care what she has to say, that would be read as a vote of no confidence in that person, and they would have to resign, right? Is there an example? I understand the DNI is not that important a job. It's kind of a made up job to begin with. But if you don't care what the director of national intelligence opinion is, maybe they shouldn't be your director of national intelligence. I mean, I don't know this stuff. You know all of this sort of intrigue thing. So I'm just, how weird is this? Was there a time when Nixon said, I don't care what Kissinger has to say? I mean, it just strikes me as very, very weird. And we take the weird, we're the boiling frog people here. We take the weirdness as more normal than it is. Has there been a normal presidential administration where this sort of thing? I mean, and I want to be one last point. I just want to anticipate something. I have absolute certainty that going back 250 odd years, presidents have, starting with George Washington, not cared what various cabinet ministers or advisors have had to say, but they tend not to say it out loud. For kind of obvious reasons. Like, no one is going to, oh, we have Tulsi Gabbard's ear. If we can convince her of this, that'll be great. Not when you now know that the president of the United States doesn't give a rat's ass about what she has to say. So, for criminology purposes, using this as the sort of the touchstone, how do you score an administration like that?
Yeah. Wow. Lot
I mean,
there.
am I just being weird here?
No,
I mean,
no,
okay.
you're exactly right. So, I'm trying to think of how to make the points that are broadly very much in agreement with you. I mean, so first point, the computer chip that's implanted in my brain is requiring me to say that I think that it's bad anytime that a president would ever disagree with his chief of intelligence.
I understand.
I'm going to try to override the computer chip. At the end of the day, our leaders have to make decisions that they need to make right. It's it's the responsibility of the intelligence community to provide them the best answers they possibly can. But at the end of the day, these are ultimately political issues. They're strategic issues. They're also really hard, right? And we should always remember that, what the intelligence community, what we ask the intelligence community to do is unbelievably hard. We're asking them to predict the future, because that's how we make decisions. We make decisions based on expectations of, if we do this, this is what will happen, right? Those kind of counterfactuals are enormously difficult. And, can we find instances where, the intelligence community said this, the administration did something else? Absolutely. Can we find instances where that was a bad idea? Sure. Look at the Bush administration before going into Iraq. And again, on the one hand, the intelligence community was completely wrong about Iraq's WMD. It was really right about post-war Iraq and what was required to do post-war Iraq. The administration agreed with them on the first, which they were wrong about, and disagreed with them about the second, on which they were right about. And, again, it's one of those where we really wish they had done the opposite. Right. But in both cases, we're suggesting that the administration would have been right to disagree with them on one thing and agree with them on another. All right. That said, I'll come back to another point that you just made, which I completely agree with, which is that if you don't trust someone who is in one of these jobs of, yes, at least purportedly great responsibility, and you're right, the DNI job isn't as important, as formidable as its title sounds, but nonetheless, that person shouldn't be there, right? There's no question about that. But a third point to make, again, this does get back to the weirdness of the Trump administration and how President Trump does things, where he undercuts his own people all the time, right? This is a point that you've made, and you're absolutely right about, I think, which is that Trump never wants to be boxed in. So anyone who goes out there and tries to speak for him and say, this is what we are or aren't doing, Trump almost reflexively contradicts them just to preserve his own freedom of action. And, there are probably, psychologists could do a lot more with that, but I'll simply say that. I mean, I can remember his first administration where, of course, he decides to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, which, we'll see where things go, but where things were headed, didn't seem like that had been a great idea, truth be told. But, we may never know what the ultimate outcome was. But, he pulled out of it. And a little while later, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gives a speech, right, where he lays out an Iran strategy. And he's more or less taking Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal and trying to make strategic sense of it. Okay. Now, the truth of the matter is, I don't think there was any strategy involved. Trump on the campaign trail had said this is the worst deal the United States had ever signed, a wild exaggeration, but nonetheless, he wanted that. And because part of what he wanted to say is, I can make a better deal. Elect me president because I'll make a better deal than Obama did. Right. And so when he gets to be president, he pulls us out of the deal simply because he said it was the worst one ever and he wants the chance to make a new one. That, I am quite convinced, is all that was going on. Mike Pompeo, God bless him, is trying to fit it into, and you can like or hate Mike Pompeo, but he's at least trying to fit it into a coherent strategy toward Iran, right? And within basically a day, Trump has contradicted and thrown the entire speech out the window. And it's like what Pompeo said had never even existed. So, again, the fact that he contradicts Tulsi Gabbard, to me, this is just par for the course. And, what I will say is that I actually, we're kind of just chalking it up to the weirdness of the Trump administration. We should recognize that there actually are prices to be paid for this, right? I mean, we are at a point where our allies have no idea what we are going to do because they don't trust anything that Trump says because he'll change his mind in a nanosecond. And they don't trust anything that any of his advisors say because they don't believe that any of his advisors actually speak for him. And, even before this, every Middle Eastern leader that I've spoken to, since Trump came back in office has just been saying, including the states that Trump went and visited, hey, we just have to make our own policy in the absence of the United States because we have no idea what you people are going to do. So we have to proceed under the assumption that you're not going to help us at all. We have to meet our own needs. And then we also have to kind of have contingency plans built in because at some point in time, you guys are going to come sweeping in out of the clear blue sky, with some cockamamie demand of us that has nothing to do with what's actually going on. It's just what Trump wants in that moment, right? That is not a good way to build up or to maintain alliances, to build these relationships, to be able to count on having allies when we need them.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, the trade stuff demonstrates that ad infinitum, right? Where the Trump administration has set 3 different policy rationales for tariffs, and they all contradict each other. I mean, I don't mean they contradict each other as in they're different rationales. I mean, literally, one makes the other one impossible. You can't be talking about how you're going to use tariffs to get everybody to lower their tariff rates so that we have free trade, and you're going to use tariffs to replace the IRS and the income tax. Either they're going to be really high tariffs or they're going to be really low tariffs. They can't be both, right? And the climate of uncertainty that on the national security side, we had a big internal argument here at the Dispatch about what the worst thing about the Signal chat fiasco was. And my view was, it shows they have lax security. Yeah, it shows our allies can't trust us with classified stuff. I agreed with everybody else's reasons, but they were all secondary to me. And the thing for me was sort of it's analogous to this thing with Tulsi, right? You can have all sorts of opinions, but as Don Corleone says to Sonny, never share them with outsiders. Never let the outsiders know what you're thinking, right? So you may think that Tulsi is a clown. Don't tell the world that, because then, well, anyway. So similarly, the significance of the group chat was JD Vance and these guys all say, I just don't want to help out Europe, right? We're saving Europe's bacon. Now, we knew that they made all sorts of public statements like that. But the ambiguity of whether this was a negotiating thing or their actual core conviction, whether it was a policy thing or a tactic, was unclear. And now, if you're a strategic planner in the UK or in France, you now know that you probably suspected it, but you now have it confirmed that the United States simply cannot be relied upon to the degree you need to the degree to which you need to rely upon it to plan on them being there for you. Mm-hmm. And so you have to plan on them maybe not being there for you. And that, I think, is sort of the larger takeaway from all of this stuff is we have made the world a more dangerous place by signaling we are not just, we may not be the world's reserve currency, but we also may not be the reserve guarantor of global stability and order and our alliances. And I don't know how you fix that in the medium term or the long term.
Yeah, I'll just tack onto that because, again, I could not agree with you more, Jonah. And this is what I'm also concerned about, right? That, after World War II, 2 big things came out of it, 2 phenomenal things. First, the United States learned the lesson of the 2 world wars, which is we can't avoid getting involved in the affairs of the rest of the world. That if we try to do so, they will come home to bite us in all kinds of different ways, whether it's through trade, whether it's through military technology, but for all these different reasons, we can't avoid it. And it is much better to be present in the world so that we can identify threats early on when they are small and can be dealt with easily and cheaply. Right? One of the great lessons of World Wars I and II was that, as wonderful as World War II was, right, not the good war, the great war, everybody's favorite American war other than the War of Independence, no one wanted to refight World War II. Right. Especially because of the risk of nuclear weapons. And so the idea was we need to be present in the world so we can identify problems and deal with them before they metastasize, right? You deal with Hitler in 1936, takes 2 or 3 brigades. By 1939, he can fight all of Europe. By 1942, he can fight the whole world, just about, right? So you want to get to these problems early. And second, again, I know you know this because you've talked about it times, we build a system, right? We build a global economic system. We build a global political, diplomatic, military system, the alliances, right? And this was enormously helpful to us. And the truth of the matter is that it was a hell of a lot cheaper than most people recognize, and we got enormous benefit from it. Right. And every time we went to war, it was so useful to have the bases, to have the allies. I mean, the Gulf War, one of my favorites, right? The Japanese don't provide anything in the Gulf War really except money. Okay. But between the Japanese and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, we probably made a profit off of the Gulf War. Nobody likes to say that. It sounds mercenary, but we probably made a profit off of that war because they paid for so much of it, right? We should always remember, Churchill's great line that the only thing worse than going to war with allies is going to war without them, right? We are eroding all of that stuff. And when it is gone, I fear that we are really going to miss it, and it is going to be incredibly hard to build back.
All right. Sadly, we're going to have to just sort of leave it there. But obviously, we will be having you back. Always great to have you on here. Always great to get some granular detail about all this. And as we talked about beforehand, you have receipts about some of our talk about Western development and all this. And so maybe we'll have you on to not be the Middle East national security egghead. And we can do more sort of historical stuff. But regardless, Ken, thank you so much for doing this, and we'll have you back.
Thank you so much, Jonah. As one of your most devoted listeners, I'm always delighted to be on the show and just love listening to you, even when I am not.
You're going to undermine your credibility with my listeners by saying you're a listener, but so be it. All right. So Ken Pollack has left the studio, and always great to talk to him, and curious what feedback is from people. I found that's very useful. More in terms of how to think about all this stuff than the specifics of this, that, or the other thing. We'll see what Israel comes up with in the days and weeks ahead. And I will say I am enjoying greatly watching all of the MAGA types who say in response to every wackadoodle thing that Trump does, and in response to every poor execution of a directionally good idea, this is what we voted for. No, actually, this is what we wanted. And now they're all, not, I shouldn't say they're all, the sort of anti-Israel caucus of, led by people like Tucker and Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of those people, and Steve Bannon, they're all getting their panties in a twist saying, this isn't what we voted for. He didn't campaign on this. And I thought it was really telling. I didn't get into the punditry with Ken, but the social media account for the White House has been flooding the internet with clips of Trump saying over and 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 over again on the campaign trail, Iran can never be allowed to have a bomb, and that he's going to do something about it. And look, what's good for you can complain about how Trump is handling this moment and all this kind of stuff, but you can't use this. I didn't vote for this. This is not what we wanted. He didn't campaign on this, because as a matter of fact, he campaigned on this as much as he did on almost anything else. And you can not like that argument, you can embrace that argument, but it's just a fact. So other than that, thanks for listening. I got to head up to New York, and I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.